The fog rolled in thick that morning, creeping across the Aleutian Islands like a living thing. It was June 1942, and the world was tearing itself apart. In the skies above the Pacific, Japanese pilots ruled absolutely. They were untouchable, invincible. Their Zero fighters carved through enemy squadrons with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. American pilots whispered about them in hushed tones, these ghosts in the sky who could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outfight anything the Allies put up against them. For 9 brutal months, the numbers told a story of absolute dominance. 12 kills for every single Zero lost, 12-1. Those weren't just statistics. Those were fathers, brothers, sons, falling from the sky in flames, while the Zeros danced away untouched. But on this particular morning, something different was about to happen. Something that would change everything. In that dense Alaskan fog, a young Japanese pilot was about to make a mistake. Just one mistake. A simple miscalculation that, in any other circumstance, would have meant nothing more than a damaged plane and perhaps a reprimand from his commanding officer. But this was not any other circumstance. This was a moment balanced on the edge of a knife, where the fate of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives, hung in the balance. And nobody knew it yet. The pilot's name was Tadayoshi Koga. He was 19 years old. Just 19. Think about that for a moment. When you're 19, you're supposed to be figuring out your life. Maybe going to college, falling in love for the first time, making mistakes that cost you nothing more than embarrassment or a few dollars. Koga was flying one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world into combat over a frozen, hostile landscape, thousands of miles from home. The weight of an empire's ambitions rested on his shoulders and the shoulders of pilots just like him. They were the cutting edge of Japan's military might, the tip of the spear driving deep into Allied territory. His Zero, the aircraft that had become a legend, hummed beneath him with a kind of mechanical perfection that Japanese engineers had poured their genius into. Every rivet, every panel, every system had been designed with one purpose in mind: air superiority. And for 9 months, it had delivered beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The Americans were terrified of it. Not just respectful, not just cautious. Terrified. Their intelligence reports before the war had dismissed Japanese aviation technology as inferior, derivative, aerodynamically impossible. The Americans had convinced themselves that Japan couldn't possibly build fighters that matched or exceeded their own. This wasn't just military assessment. This was racism dressed up in technical language. The assumption that an Asian nation couldn't possibly compete with Western engineering prowess. Then came December 7th, 1941, and everything the Americans thought they knew turned to ash. The Zeros that swept over Pearl Harbor moved with a speed and agility that seemed to defy physics. They climbed at impossible angles. They turned inside the pursuit curves of American fighters, getting behind them, lining up perfect shots, while American pilots yanked their controls and felt their aircraft wallow in response. In the months that followed, the story repeated itself again and again. At Wake Island, at Singapore, over the Philippines, in the skies above Java and Burma, the Zero established absolute dominance. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros came back with 1,000-yard stares and stories that sounded like they were describing encounters with UFOs. Admiral William Leonard, one of the most experienced aviation officers in the US Navy, would later say something that captured the desperation of that moment perfectly. He said, "No other captured machine has ever unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great." Think about those words. Think about what they mean. The United States military, the most powerful industrial nation on Earth, was being systematically beaten in the air by an opponent whose technology they had completely underestimated. And they knew, they absolutely knew, that unless something changed, the Pacific War was going to be a long, bloody, devastating defeat. But back to that foggy morning in June. Back to Tadayoshi Koga, 19 years old, flying through the mist over Akutan Island. He was part of a strike force that had just attacked Dutch Harbour, a strategic American installation in the Aleutians. The attack was part of a larger operation, a diversionary thrust meant to draw American attention away from the real prize, Midway Island. The Japanese plan was elegant in its complexity. Hit the Americans in Alaska, make them think the main assault was coming from the north, then swing south and crush the American carriers at Midway. It was bold, it was brilliant, and it was about to fail spectacularly, though Koga didn't know that yet. Nobody knew that yet. What Koga did know was that his Zero had taken damage. Not catastrophic damage. Not the kind of hits that send an aircraft spinning into the sea in seconds. But damage nonetheless. Maybe it was anti-aircraft fire clipping his fuel line. Maybe it was a lucky shot from an American rear gunner. The records aren't entirely clear, and in the chaos of combat, these things often aren't. What matters is that Koga's aircraft was losing fuel, and he knew he couldn't make it back to the carrier. He needed to put down, and he needed to put down soon. Japanese doctrine was clear in situations like this. Absolutely clear. If your aircraft is going down, and there's any chance it might fall into enemy hands, you destroy it. You set it on fire. You crash it into the ocean. You do whatever it takes to ensure the enemy learns nothing from your technology. This wasn't just military policy. This was sacred duty. The Zero was Japan's secret weapon, the source of their air superiority, and protecting its secrets was considered as important as any combat mission. Pilots were trained, conditioned, indoctrinated to understand this. Better to die than let the enemy capture your aircraft intact. And Koga intended to follow that doctrine. He really did. He looked down through the fog and saw what appeared to be a flat, open area on Akutan Island. It looked perfect for an emergency landing. Soft ground, relatively level, no major obstacles. He could put the Zero down, destroy it, and wait for rescue. Simple. Straightforward. He'd done emergency landing drills dozens of times in training. This would be no different. Except it was different. Because what Koga saw from the air, what looked like firm, flat ground, was actually something else entirely. It was a bog. A marshy, waterlogged patch of tundra covered with moss and grass that made it look solid from altitude. From up there, in the fog, with fuel streaming from his damaged aircraft and adrenaline flooding his system, Koga made the kind of judgment call that pilots make 100 times in their careers. And this time, just this once, he was wrong. The Zero came in smooth. Koga's skill was evident even in emergency. The aircraft touched down with the kind of grace you'd expect from a pilot trained by the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had the most rigorous fighter pilot program in the world at that time. But the moment the wheels made contact with that deceptive ground, everything went wrong. The landing gear didn't roll, it sank. It plunged straight down into the waterlogged earth, and the Zero's nose pitched forward violently. The momentum that had been carrying the aircraft in a controlled glide suddenly became a brutal force. The aircraft flipped, metal shrieked. The cockpit, That carefully engineered space, where Koga had felt so powerful just moments before, became a crushing vice. Tadayoshi Koga died instantly. His neck snapped from the impact. 19 years old, a warrior pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy, one of the elite, and he died alone in the fog on an island so remote that most maps didn't even bother to name it properly. There was no glorious final battle, no last radioed words of defiance or poetry, just a young man, far from home, killed by a simple miscalculation and bad luck. The Zero sat there, half buried in the bog, remarkably intact. The flip had damaged it, certainly, but the soft ground had cushioned the impact in a way that solid earth wouldn't have. The fuselage was whole. The wings were bent, but not shattered. Most critically, the engine, the weapons, the flight systems, all the internal mechanisms that made the Zero such a devastating fighter. They were all there, intact, waiting. For 5 weeks, the Zero sat in that bog. The weather in the Aleutians in summer is its own special kind of misery. Cold rain, more fog, wind that cuts through everything. The island was desolate, barely visited. Japanese forces, reeling from their devastating defeat at Midway, which was unfolding even as Koga made his final flight, had no resources to spare for recovering a downed fighter from a minor island in the middle of nowhere. They assumed, if they thought about it at all, that the aircraft had been destroyed according to protocol, that Koga had done his duty. American forces in the region were aware that Japanese planes had been operating in the area. They'd found debris from other aircraft, pieces scattered across various islands, but actually finding an intact Zero? That seemed like an impossible dream. The Japanese were so fanatical about keeping their technology secret. Every previous capture attempt had resulted in finding nothing but burned wreckage or aircraft that had been shot to pieces. The Zero's secrets remained locked away, mysterious, seemingly untouchable. Then an American patrol found it. A routine reconnaissance mission flying over Akutan Island. Someone looked down and saw something that didn't belong. A shape that was too regular, too mechanical to be natural. They circled lower. The fog parted for just a moment, just long enough to see the unmistakable profile of a Zero fighter. Intact. Sitting there like someone had simply parked it and walked away. The radio chatter that followed was probably frantic, though the official records are typically understated in that military fashion. What they'd found wasn't just an aircraft. It was the holy grail of military intelligence. This was the machine that was winning the air war. This was the mystery that American engineers had been desperate to solve. And it was just sitting there, waiting to give up its secrets. Getting to it was the next challenge. Akutan Island isn't easily accessible even today. In 1942, with wartime resources stretched thin, organizing a recovery operation was a logistical nightmare. They needed to get personnel to the island, assess the aircraft's condition, figure out how to extract it from the bog without causing more damage, and do all of this while the war continued to rage across the Pacific. And they needed to do it fast, before the weather turned, before Japanese forces potentially organized their own recovery attempt, before anything happened to damage this incredible prize they'd stumbled upon. A recovery team assembled with impressive speed. These were men who understood what was at stake. Engineers, pilots, intelligence officers, mechanics. They landed on Akutan and made their way to the crash site. What they found exceeded their wildest hopes. Yes, the aircraft had flipped. Yes, there was damage. But structurally, mechanically, it was remarkably intact. The bog that had killed Koga had also preserved his aircraft. The soft, waterlogged ground had cushioned the impact in a way that solid earth never could have. They found Koga's body still in the cockpit. By all accounts, they treated his remains with respect. Whatever else was happening in the war, whatever propaganda both sides were spreading about the enemy, these men were professionals who understood that the young pilot had been a warrior like themselves. He was buried on the island with military honours. His sacrifice, though it served the enemy he'd fought against, was acknowledged. Then came the delicate, painstaking work of recovery. They couldn't just drag the Zero out of the bog. Every movement had to be calculated. They built supports, used carefully placed jacks and levers, essentially excavated the aircraft from the earth that held it. It took days. The weather fought them the entire time. But slowly, carefully, they freed the Zero from the bog and prepared it for transport. Getting it off the island required disassembling it to some degree, packing components carefully, loading everything onto ships. The entire operation was conducted under tight security. The fewer people who knew about this, the better. If Japanese intelligence got wind that the Americans had captured an intact Zero, they might change tactics, might modify their aircraft, might do any number of things that would reduce the intelligence value of the capture. Secrecy was absolutely paramount. The Zero was shipped to Naval Air Station San Diego. It arrived in crates, carefully labelled, each component catalogued. When American engineers and test pilots first saw it fully assembled on the ground, their reactions ranged from fascination to something approaching awe. This was the bogeyman. This was the aircraft that had been massacring American pilots for 9 months. And now they could touch it, examine it, take it apart piece by piece, and understand exactly how it worked. The first thing that struck them was how light it was. The Zero weighed just 3,704 pounds empty. Compare that to American fighters of the era, which were thousands of pounds heavier. This lightweight construction explained the Zero's incredible maneuverability. Less weight meant it could change direction faster, climb quicker, turn inside any opponent. It was like comparing a rapier to a broadsword. The American fighters were built to take punishment. The Zero was built to avoid being hit in the first place. But that lightweight came with trade-offs, and understanding those trade-offs was going to change everything. The engineers started finding them immediately. No armor plating for the pilot. None. American fighters had evolved to include armor behind the pilot's seat, protecting them from rear attacks. The Zero had nothing. A single bullet in the wrong place could kill the pilot instantly. No self-sealing fuel tanks. This was a critical discovery. American aircraft had fuel tanks that automatically sealed around bullet holes, preventing fires and explosions. The Zero's fuel tanks were just thin metal. One tracer round and the whole aircraft could become a fireball. These weren't oversights. These were deliberate design choices. Japanese engineers had decided that the performance advantages of lightweight outweighed the defensive disadvantages. And for the kind of combat they'd been fighting, they'd been right. The Zero's agility allowed it to almost always get the first shot, to control the terms of engagement. If you're shooting the other guy down before he can shoot at you, you don't need armor. If you're never getting hit, self-sealing fuel tanks are just dead weight. But American engineers, looking at this aircraft with fresh eyes informed by 9 months of brutal combat, saw something else. They saw vulnerability. They saw weaknesses that could be exploited if American pilots knew what to look for and changed their tactics accordingly. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders got the assignment of his career. He was going to fly the Zero. He was going to put this legendary fighter through its paces and figure out exactly what it could and couldn't do. The first flight was scheduled with appropriate ceremony and security. This wasn't just a test flight. This was a potential turning point in the war. Sanders climbed into the cockpit. The instruments were all in Japanese, but by this point they'd been labelled with English translations. The seat where Tadayoshi Koga had spent his final moments had been replaced. Everything was as ready as it could be. Sanders fired up the engine. The Nakajima Sake radial engine roared to life, with a sound that was both familiar and alien. Radial engines all sound similar, but there was something about this one, some quality to its note, that marked it as foreign. He taxied out, took a breath, advanced the throttle, and the Zero leapt into the air with an eagerness that immediately made clear why American pilots had been so outmatched. The acceleration was remarkable. The climb rate was extraordinary. Sanders put the Zero through basic maneuvers, getting a feel for how it handled, and what he felt was both impressive and revealing. The Zero was incredibly responsive at low speeds. It could turn tighter than anything Sanders had ever flown. At speeds below 200 knots, the Zero was essentially unbeatable in a turning fight. It could literally fly circles around American fighters. This explained so many combat reports. American pilots trying to turn with Zeros, finding themselves unable to bring their guns to bear as the Japanese fighters simply outturned them, getting behind them, lining up killing shots. But then Sanders started pushing the Zero to higher speeds. And he found something interesting. Something that would prove to be absolutely critical. At speeds above 200 knots, above 230 miles per hour, the Zero's ailerons started to stiffen up dramatically. The cables and linkages that controlled the ailerons, the control surfaces that allowed the aircraft to roll, weren't boosted by hydraulics like American fighters. They were pure mechanical linkage. And at high speed, the air pressure on those ailerons was so intense that it took enormous physical force to move the controls. Sanders tried to execute a high-speed roll. The control stick felt like it was welded in place. He had to use both hands and all his strength to get the Zero to respond. And even then, the roll rate was slow. Painfully slow compared to American fighters at the same speed. At high velocity, the Zero transformed from a nimble dogfighter into something that handled like a truck. He pushed the aircraft into a dive, accelerated to maximum speed. The Zero was fast in level flight, but in a dive, it simply couldn't keep up with American fighters. The lightweight construction that made it so maneuverable at low speeds became a liability at high speeds. The aircraft felt like it might shake itself apart. Sanders pulled out of the dive and noted that the Zero had actually slowed down more quickly than an American fighter would have. Less weight meant less momentum. Back on the ground, Sanders was debriefed for hours. Every detail of the flight was recorded, analysed, dissected. Other test pilots flew the Zero. Engineers pored over every measurement, every data point, and gradually a picture emerged. The Zero was a brilliant aircraft, but it wasn't invincible. It wasn't some magical machine that defied the laws of physics. It was an engineering solution with specific strengths and specific weaknesses. And those weaknesses could be exploited. The most critical discovery was about energy management. The Zero excelled at what's called a turning fight, or angles fight, where aircraft try to outmaneuver each other at relatively low speeds. But it was vulnerable in an energy fight, where aircraft use speed and altitude, diving and climbing, maintaining high velocities rather than engaging in slow-speed maneuvering. American fighters, built heavier and with more powerful engines, could dictate the terms of engagement by staying fast. This insight seems simple now, but in 1942 it was revolutionary. American fighter tactics had evolved from decades of thinking about aerial combat as essentially a knife fight in the sky. World War I aces had engaged in swirling dogfights where the tightest turning radius won. That thinking had carried forward. American pilots had been trying to fight the Zero on its own terms, engaging in turning battles where the Zero's advantages were overwhelming. What the captured Zero proved was that American pilots needed to completely rethink their approach. Don't turn with a Zero. Never, ever try to outturn a Zero at low speeds. Instead, use the advantages American fighters had. Dive from above. Make a high-speed pass. If you miss, don't stay and fight. Extend away, using your superior dive speed. Climb back up, using your superior power-to-weight ratio at high speeds. Set up another attack. Rinse and repeat. These tactics were formalized into training doctrine with remarkable speed. The information was distributed through training squadrons, through combat units, through technical bulletins and tactical updates. New pilot training programs incorporated lessons learned from the captured Zero. Veteran pilots who'd been flying the wrong tactics were retrained. The entire American aerial warfare doctrine in the Pacific was rewritten based on what that single captured aircraft revealed. But the intelligence bonanza went deeper than just flight characteristics. Engineers completely disassembled the Zero. Every component was examined, photographed, measured, analyzed. The engine was taken apart piece by piece. The weapon systems were studied. The manufacturing techniques were assessed. And additional insights emerged. The Nakajima Sakai engine was beautifully made, with tolerances that impressed American engineers. But it was also complex and required high-quality materials. It needed frequent maintenance. In contrast, American engines like the Pratt & Whitney radials were designed to be more forgiving, to run under adverse conditions, to be maintained by less skilled mechanics. The Japanese philosophy emphasized quality and precision. The American philosophy emphasized reliability and mass production. Neither was wrong, but they reflected different strategic realities. The Zero's armament was examined in detail. 2 7.7mm machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, plus 2 20mm cannons mounted in the wings. The cannons were particularly interesting. They were slow-firing but devastating when they hit. The Americans noted the rate of fire, the ammunition capacity, the ballistics. This information would inform defensive tactics. If you could make a Zero miss with its initial burst, if you could force it to expend its limited cannon ammunition, the pilot would be down to just machine guns, which were far less effective. Even the little things mattered. The quality of the windscreen, the design of the gun sight, the layout of the instrument panel, the placement of controls. American designers were preparing the next generation of fighters, and every insight from the captured Zero influenced those designs. The F-6F Hellcat, which would go on to become the dominant American carrier fighter of the war, was directly influenced by intelligence gathered from Koga's Zero. The Hellcat incorporated lessons learned: heavier armor, more powerful engine, good high-speed handling, ability to absorb damage. It was designed specifically to fight Zeros using the tactics the captured aircraft had revealed. The psychological impact of the captured Zero rippled through the American military. For 9 months, The Zero had been this mysterious, invincible enemy. Now it was revealed to be a very good aircraft with exploitable weaknesses. American pilots who'd been approaching combat with a sense of dread now approached it with confidence. They had knowledge. They had tactics. They had a plan. The mystique of the Zero evaporated like fog burning off in the morning sun. Japanese forces, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. They didn't know the Zero had been captured intact. They didn't know American engineers were reverse engineering every system. They didn't know American pilots were training specifically to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. The Japanese kept flying the same tactics, kept relying on the same advantages, unaware that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. The impact became apparent in combat statistics over the following months. That devastating 12-to-1 kill ratio started to shift. Not immediately, not overnight. Tactical changes take time to propagate through a military force. Pilots need training. New tactics need to be tested in combat and refined. But gradually, inexorably, the numbers started to even out. Then they started to favor the Americans. By 1943, American pilots weren't just surviving encounters with Zeros. They were winning them, consistently. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots. In one engagement, the Japanese lost hundreds of aircraft, while American losses were minimal. The Zero pilots, flying the same tactics that had dominated in 1942, were systematically destroyed by American pilots flying Hellcats and Corsairs, using tactics and flying aircraft designed specifically to exploit the weaknesses revealed by that one captured Zero. It's worth pausing to consider the human cost behind these statistics. Every aircraft that went down was a person. The Japanese pilots in 1944 were often far less experienced than the elite who'd fought in 1942. The veterans, the experts, the pilots, with hundreds of hours of training, they'd been killed off in the grinding attrition of 3 years of brutal warfare. The replacements had less training, less experience, and were flying tactics that no longer worked against an enemy that had figured them out completely. The strategic implications extended beyond just air combat. Air superiority meant American bombers could operate more freely. It meant American ground forces could receive better close air support. It meant Japanese shipping could be interdicted more effectively. It meant American carriers could operate with less fear of aerial attack. The ripple effects of that one captured aircraft touched every aspect of the Pacific War. Historians have debated counterfactuals endlessly. What if Koga had succeeded in destroying the Zero? What if he'd crashed into the ocean instead of onto that bog? What if American forces hadn't found it, or had found it too damaged to be useful? Would the war have lasted longer? Would American casualties have been higher? These are impossible questions to answer with certainty, but the educated guesses generally agree. Yes, the war would have been longer and bloodier without the intelligence gained from the captured Zero. Admiral William Leonard's quote bears repeating. No other captured machine has ever unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great. He wasn't exaggerating. The capture of Koga's Zero was arguably the single most valuable piece of tactical intelligence in the Pacific War. It came at exactly the right moment, when American forces were still reeling from early defeats, when they desperately needed something to shift the balance. But let's return, for a moment, to Tadayoshi Koga. Because in all the strategic analysis, in all the discussion of kill ratios and tactics and engineering specifications, it's easy to lose sight of the human at the center of this story. He was 19 years old. He'd been trained by one of the most demanding military systems in the world. He'd survived the intense selection process to become a naval aviator. He'd flown combat missions in what was, at the time, the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. And he died because of a simple miscalculation, a trick of perspective, bad luck. Did Koga die thinking he'd failed? Did he have time to think at all? The impact that killed him was instantaneous. Perhaps there was a split second of realization as the ground rushed up wrong, as the aircraft started to pitch forward, as he understood that this wasn't going to be a routine emergency landing, or perhaps there wasn't even that much time. Perhaps one moment he was flying, a skilled pilot executing a difficult maneuver, and the next moment there was nothing. His family in Japan would have received notification eventually. The formal language of military death notifications, translated across cultures, probably said something about honorable death in service to the emperor, about sacrifice for the nation. They would not have been told that his aircraft was captured. They would not have known that their son's final flight contributed, through a cruel irony, to the defeat of the cause he died for. The Zero itself survived the war, and for many years afterward. After testing was complete, it was eventually retired to museum storage. For decades it sat, a relic of a pivotal moment in history. In recent years, there's been discussion about restoring it to flight-worthy condition, about preserving this irreplaceable piece of history. Whether that happens or not, the aircraft remains a tangible link to that morning in June 1942 when one young pilot's mistake changed the course of a war. There's a broader story here too, about the nature of technological competition and military innovation. The Zero, in 1941, represented the cutting edge of fighter design. It was optimized for a specific kind of combat, based on Japanese naval doctrine and their assessment of what characteristics would be most valuable in a carrier-based fighter. And for the first 9 months of the war, that assessment appeared to be absolutely correct. The Zero dominated. But technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a context of tactics, of doctrine, of the broader strategic situation. The Zero was designed for an offensive war where Japanese pilots would have the initiative, where they could choose the terms of engagement, where their superior maneuverability would allow them to dominate one-on-one encounters. It wasn't designed for a defensive war, for fighting against an enemy that outnumbered them, for facing pilots who'd figured out how to negate its advantages. The American response, once they understood the Zero's strengths and weaknesses, was to develop both tactics and technology to counter it. The tactics came first, developed directly from studying the captured aircraft. The technology followed, as designers incorporated lessons learned into new aircraft like the Hellcat. This cycle of innovation and counter-innovation is the fundamental dynamic of military technology. No weapon system remains dominant forever. Every strength implies a weakness. Every advantage can be countered. The Japanese, for their part, did develop improved versions of the Zero as the war progressed. They added more armor, more powerful engines, better armament. But they were always playing catch-up, always reacting to American innovations, and they lacked the industrial capacity to implement improvements as quickly as the Americans could. The fundamental dynamic of the Pacific War was that America could absorb losses and replace them faster than Japan could. American industrial might, once it was fully mobilized and directed toward the war effort, was simply overwhelming. But that's the strategic picture, the view from 30,000 feet, so to speak. What about the tactical level? What about the individual pilots who flew these missions, who put the new tactics into practice? who tested them in combat, where failure meant death. American fighter pilot training changed dramatically after the captured Zero's secrets were revealed. New pilots were taught specific maneuvers: boom and zoom, dive from altitude, make your attack at high speed. Don't get drawn into a turning fight. If a Zero gets on your tail, don't try to turn out. Push your throttle forward, extend away in a shallow dive, use your superior speed. The Zero can't follow you into a high-speed dive. It'll shake itself apart, trying. These lessons were sometimes taught using the captured Zero itself. Selected pilots were given orientation flights in it, so they could feel firsthand how it handled, understand its characteristics directly, rather than just reading about them in briefings. Imagine being an American fighter pilot in 1943, getting the opportunity to fly the aircraft that had been killing your fellow pilots just a year before. The mixture of professional interest and personal emotion must have been intense. Combat reports from late 1942 onward start to show the change. Pilots explicitly noting in their after-action reports that they used tactics designed to exploit the Zero's weaknesses. Commanders analyzing engagements and noting how the new tactical doctrine was being applied. The kill ratios shifting. The confidence growing. There's a specific example worth noting. During the Guadalcanal campaign in late 1942 and early 1943, American pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, which were inferior to the Zero in almost every performance metric, started consistently beating Zero pilots. Not because the Wildcat suddenly became a better aircraft. It didn't. But because Wildcat pilots stopped trying to dogfight Zeros and instead used tactics that emphasized the Wildcat's strengths: ruggedness, good high-speed handling, ability to absorb damage. They worked in pairs, covering each other. They maintained altitude and energy. They dictated the terms of engagement. And they won. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one. American pilots went from seeing the Zero as an unstoppable monster to seeing it as a worthy but beatable opponent. That change in mindset translated directly into combat effectiveness. Confidence affects decision-making. Pilots who believe they can win fight differently than pilots who expect to lose. They're more aggressive at the right moments. They take calculated risks. They press their advantages. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots were experiencing the opposite psychological shift. The early war had been a time of stunning victories. They'd swept Allied air forces from the sky. They'd operated with virtual impunity. But as 1942 turned to 1943, that started to change. American aircraft that had been easy prey suddenly weren't. American pilots who'd been tentative and defensive suddenly were aggressive and skilled. The psychological advantage shifted. Japanese military culture made it difficult to adapt to this new reality. There was a reluctance to admit that tactics needed to change, that the Zero's dominance was ending. This wasn't just stubbornness. It was rooted in the hierarchical nature of Japanese military organization, where questioning established doctrine could be seen as insubordination. The very system that had created the disciplined, skilled pilots who dominated in early 1942 made it difficult to adapt when the situation changed. There's also the simple matter of attrition. The Japanese pilot training program, while excellent, was slow. It took a long time to create an expert pilot. In the early war, Japan had a core of highly experienced naval aviators, many of whom had combat experience from the war in China. These were the elite. These were the pilots who'd achieved the 12-to-1 kill ratios. But as the war ground on, these veterans were killed off. Every combat mission carried risk. Over months and years, those risks accumulated. The best pilots, the ones with hundreds of hours of experience, died one by one. The replacements had less training. The Japanese training program couldn't keep up with losses. As American pilots were getting better, Japanese pilots were getting worse on average. This wasn't because Japanese pilots were somehow inferior. It was because the Japanese military-industrial complex couldn't match American output. They couldn't train pilots as fast as America could. They couldn't replace aircraft as quickly. They couldn't sustain the logistical chain that kept units supplied and equipped. By 1944, the average Japanese pilot had a fraction of the training hours that American pilots received. They were often sent into combat with barely enough skills to take off and land. They certainly didn't have the experience to engage in complex dogfighting maneuvers. Against these less experienced pilots, flying tactics that no longer worked, American pilots flying aircraft designed to exploit the Zero's weaknesses achieved devastating results. The Great Marianas, Turkey Shoot, mentioned earlier, was the culmination of this trend. Japanese carrier aviation was essentially destroyed in a single day. Hundreds of aircraft lost. A generation of pilots wiped out. And at the root of this disaster, among many other factors, was the intelligence gained from one captured Zero 2 years earlier. The tactics, the training, the aircraft design, the confidence. All of it traced back, in part, to that foggy morning in the Aleutians when Tadayoshi Koga made his final mistake. There's a philosophical question embedded in all of this. How much does a single moment matter? How much can one event, one mistake, one piece of luck change the course of history? We like to think of history as driven by great forces, by economics and ideology and geography, and those things matter enormously. But sometimes a 19-year-old pilot misjudges a landing, and the ripples spread outward in ways that touch thousands of lives. If Koga had landed 100 yards to the left or right, on firm ground instead of bog, he might have survived. He might have destroyed the Zero according to protocol. The aircraft's secrets would have remained secret. American pilots would have continued to struggle against an enemy they didn't fully understand. Would the Allies have still won? Almost certainly yes. The fundamental imbalance in industrial capacity and resources made a Japanese victory ultimately impossible. But the path to that victory might have been longer, bloodier, more costly in human lives. Or consider an even smaller change. If the American patrol had flown its reconnaissance mission an hour earlier or later, they might have missed seeing the downed Zero. If the weather had been just slightly worse, the aircraft might have been hidden from aerial observation. If Japanese forces had organized a recovery mission faster, they might have retrieved the aircraft before American forces got there. Any of these small changes, any of these minor variations, and one of the most valuable intelligence coups of the war doesn't happen. History balances on these knife edges more often than we like to admit. We construct narratives that make events seem inevitable in retrospect. But in the moment, everything is contingent. Everything depends on 1,000 small decisions and random chances. Tadayoshi Koga chose to land on Akutan Island instead of ditching in the ocean. That choice wasn't inevitable. It was a decision made in the moment, based on incomplete information under pressure. And that choice cascaded into consequences that affected the course of the war. There's also the matter of institutional response. The Americans, having captured the Zero, responded with impressive speed and effectiveness. They got the aircraft back to the United States quickly. They assembled the right team of engineers and test pilots. They conducted thorough, systematic testing. They analyzed the results and incorporated them into doctrine and training. They distributed the information through the military efficiently. None of this was guaranteed. It required competent people making good decisions at multiple levels. Contrast this with some other potential responses. The captured aircraft could have been treated as a trophy rather than an intelligence asset. Testing could have been slow and unsystematic. Lessons learned could have stayed siloed within a small group instead of being distributed widely. The institutional response to the windfall could have squandered its potential value. But it didn't. The American military, for all its flaws and problems, recognized what it had and made excellent use of it. This speaks to something important about how organizations learn and adapt. The ability to recognize valuable information, to analyze it effectively, and to implement changes based on that analysis is a crucial organizational capability. It's not glamorous. It doesn't make for exciting stories the way battles and dramatic moments do. But it's fundamental to success in any competitive endeavor, whether that's warfare or business or science or anything else. The Japanese military, as mentioned earlier, had more difficulty adapting. This wasn't because Japanese officers were stupid or inflexible as individuals. Many were brilliant tacticians. But the organizational culture made certain kinds of adaptation difficult. Questioning established doctrine was discouraged. Admitting that the enemy had gained an advantage was seen as defeatist. The same cultural factors that created such disciplined, dedicated warriors also made it harder to respond to changing circumstances. Neither system was perfectly good or perfectly bad. Both had strengths and weaknesses. But in the specific context of the Pacific War, the American system's advantages in institutional learning and adaptation proved crucial. Let's consider the technical details of the Zero's design a bit more deeply, because they illustrate some interesting principles about engineering trade-offs. The Zero's designer, Jiro Horikoshi, was working under very specific constraints. The Japanese Navy wanted a carrier-based fighter with exceptional range and maneuverability. Carrier-based aircraft have to be relatively light because they need to take off from and land on short flight decks. They need to be strong enough to withstand arrested landings, where a tail hook catches a cable and brings the aircraft to a stop in a very short distance. These are challenging, often contradictory requirements. Horikoshi's solution was elegant. He used advanced aluminum alloys that were stronger for their weight than conventional materials. He eliminated everything that wasn't absolutely essential. He made the landing gear retract to reduce drag. He designed a wing that was large enough to provide good low-speed handling, but thin enough to be efficient at high speed. The result was an aircraft that met the Navy's requirements brilliantly. But every design choice involves trade-offs. The focus on lightweight meant sacrificing protection. The emphasis on range meant carrying a lot of fuel in unprotected tanks. The priority given to maneuverability meant accepting poor high-speed handling. These weren't mistakes. They were conscious decisions based on Japanese naval doctrine and their assessment of what would be most valuable in combat. For the early months of the war, those decisions were validated by results. The Zero's advantages were more important than its disadvantages, given the nature of the combat that was occurring. But as the war evolved, as American tactics changed, as the strategic situation shifted, those trade-offs became more problematic. The vulnerabilities that had been acceptable when Japanese pilots had the initiative became critical weaknesses when they were on the defensive. This is a pattern that repeats throughout military history. Weapon systems are designed for specific contexts. When the context changes, weaknesses that were previously acceptable become critical. The problem is that designing and building new weapon systems takes time. By the time the Japanese recognized that they needed fighters with better protection and high-speed handling, it was too late to develop and field them in sufficient numbers. The Americans, in contrast, were just beginning to fully mobilize their industrial capacity in 1942. The designs that would dominate the later war years, the Hellcat and Corsair and others, were on the drawing boards or in early production. Those designs incorporated lessons learned from early combat and, critically, from the captured Zero. They were optimized for a different kind of warfare than the Zero was. And they were produced in vast numbers that Japanese industry simply couldn't match. Consider the production numbers. From 1942 to 1945, Japan produced approximately 10,000 Zeros of all variants. The United States produced more than 12,000 Hellcats alone, plus thousands of Corsairs, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and other types. The disparity is staggering. Even if Japanese pilots had maintained their tactical edge, even if the Zero had remained competitive as a design, the sheer numerical advantage would have been overwhelming. But numbers only tell part of the story. Quality matters too. And by 1944, Japanese manufacturing quality was declining due to shortages of materials and skilled labor. The beautiful precision engineering of early Zeros gave way to rougher construction with inferior materials. Engines were less reliable. Systems were less robust. Meanwhile, American manufacturing quality was improving as production methods were refined and standardized. The captured Zero influenced American manufacturing as well as American tactics. Engineers studied how the Japanese achieved such tight tolerances with relatively simple tools. Some manufacturing techniques were adopted. Others were noted as areas where American methods were superior. This kind of detailed technical intelligence is invaluable for industrial planning. There's also the matter of maintenance and logistics. The Zero required skilled maintenance and high-quality fuel and lubricants. As the war progressed and Japanese supply lines were interdicted by American submarines and aircraft, getting the right materials to the right places became increasingly difficult. Maintenance quality declined. Aircraft were kept flying with jury-rigged repairs. Pilots flew aircraft that weren't properly maintained because there were no replacements. American logistics, while far from perfect, were generally more robust. The industrial base could produce spare parts in vast quantities. The supply system, for all its complexity, generally got materials where they needed to be. Aircraft that were too damaged to repair were simply scrapped and replaced. The Americans could afford wastage in a way the Japanese couldn't. All of these factors compound. Better tactics plus better aircraft plus more aircraft plus better logistics plus better pilot training equals a systematic advantage that becomes overwhelming over time. The captured Zero was just one factor among many, but it was an important factor that came at a critical moment. Let's return to the human element one more time, because while it's fascinating to discuss tactics and technology and industrial capacity, those things are ultimately abstractions. What actually happened was that thousands of young men, on both sides, fought and died in the air over the Pacific. Every statistic represents a human life. Every aircraft lost was a person who didn't come home. American pilots who survived the early months of the war, when the Zero was dominant, often had vivid memories of that time. The terror of seeing your wingman explode in flames, the helpless feeling of having a Zero on your tail and knowing you couldn't outturn it, the relief and grief of surviving when others didn't. These memories stayed with them for the rest of their lives. When the tide turned, when American pilots started winning consistently, there must have been a sense of vindication, justice for fallen comrades, proof that their sacrifices hadn't been in vain. But also, probably, a kind of sadness. Because by 1944, the Japanese pilots they were fighting were often poorly trained kids who barely knew how to fly. Shooting them down wasn't combat between equals. It was slaughter. Some American pilots found it disturbing. Others rationalized it as just war. Most probably didn't think about it much, just did their jobs and tried to survive each mission. Japanese pilots in the later war faced a different kind of nightmare. They knew they were overmatched. They knew their aircraft were inferior to what they were facing. They knew their training was inadequate. But they flew anyway, because their culture demanded it, because orders were orders, because to refuse was unthinkable. Many adopted a fatalistic attitude. They expected to die. The question was just whether they'd take any Americans with them. The kamikazes were the ultimate expression of this fatalism. If you're going to die anyway, might as well make your death count for something. The kamikaze campaign was a logical extension of Japanese military culture, combined with the desperate strategic situation of late 1944 and 1945. It was also, in a sense, an admission that they'd lost the air war. Conventional tactics weren't working, so they'd resort to suicide attacks. American forces developed countermeasures to kamikazes, but the psychological impact was significant. There's something particularly disturbing about an enemy who's not trying to survive, who's actively seeking death as a weapon. It violated Western military sensibilities. But it was effective, to a point. Kamikazes caused significant damage to American ships. They just couldn't cause enough damage to change the outcome of the war. Would the kamikaze campaign have been necessary if the Japanese had maintained air superiority? Probably not. But they didn't maintain it. They lost it, gradually but inexorably, starting from the moment the Americans captured that zero and figured out how to beat it. There's a monument on Akutan Island now, marking the spot where Koga's Zero crashed. It's remote. Few people visit, but it's there, acknowledging that something important happened in that place. The inscription, in both English and Japanese, notes the historical significance of the crash site. It doesn't make judgments about the war or the people involved. It just records that a young pilot died here, and his death had consequences that rippled far beyond his own life. Koga's name is remembered in both countries now, but for different reasons. In Japan, he's sometimes cited as an example of a warrior who did his duty and died in service to his country. The fact that his aircraft was captured is often downplayed or omitted from Japanese accounts. It's not something that fits comfortably into the narrative of honorable sacrifice. In America, Koga is remembered primarily as the unwitting contributor to American victory, the enemy pilot whose misfortune became American fortune. There's sometimes an uncomfortable celebratory tone to American accounts, a sense of triumphalism that can feel disrespectful to Koga's memory. He was, after all, just doing his job. He didn't choose to help the Americans. Circumstance did that for him. The most balanced view probably acknowledges both perspectives. Koga was a skilled pilot who died serving his country. The capture of his aircraft was a significant intelligence coup for the Americans that contributed to their eventual victory. Both things are true. Neither diminishes the other. The Zero itself, the physical aircraft that Koga flew, has been preserved as a historical artifact. It's been restored to some degree, though it no longer flies. It's appeared in museums and exhibitions. People look at it and see different things. Some see a beautiful example of engineering. Some see a relic of a terrible war. Some see a reminder of Japanese technological prowess. Some see a symbol of how wars are won, not just through combat, but through intelligence and adaptation. All of these perspectives have validity. The Zero is all of those things and more. It's a machine, certainly, but it's also a repository of human stories. Jiro Horikoshi's genius in designing it, the factory workers who built it, Tadayoshi Koga who flew it on its final flight, the American recovery team who salvaged it from the bog, Eddie Sanders and the other test pilots who flew it and figured out its secrets, the engineers who analyzed it, the instructors who incorporated lessons learned into training, the pilots who used that knowledge to survive and win. Every person who touched that aircraft or was affected by the knowledge gained from it is part of its story. This is what makes history fascinating and complex. Individual lives intersecting with vast forces, personal decisions having strategic consequences, a moment of bad luck or good luck changing the course of events, the interplay between technology and tactics, between industrial capacity and individual skill, between cultural factors and practical realities. The Pacific War was decided by many factors. Geography gave the United States advantages in resources and strategic depth. Demographics meant America could field far larger forces. Industrial capacity meant American production vastly exceeded Japanese. Cryptographic successes allowed American commanders to anticipate Japanese moves. All of these things mattered enormously. But tactics and training and intelligence also mattered. And in that domain, the capture of Koga's Zero stands out as a single event with disproportionate impact. It came at exactly the right moment. It provided exactly the information that was needed. It was exploited effectively by competent people. The result was a significant shift in the air war that saved American lives and shortened the conflict. There's also a cautionary tale here about the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of protecting critical technology. The Japanese believed their operational security was tight. They believed that even if a Zero was captured, it would be destroyed or too damaged to provide useful intelligence. They underestimated both the possibility of an intact capture and the American ability to exploit it. Modern militaries are acutely aware of this lesson. Advanced technology is guarded obsessively. Self-destruct mechanisms are built into sensitive systems. Contingency plans exist for denying technology to the enemy. The lessons of Koga's Zero are taught in intelligence and security courses as an example of what can happen when operational security fails. But perfect security is impossible. Accidents happen. Equipment malfunctions. Pilots make mistakes. The goal is to minimize the risk, but risk can never be eliminated entirely. Every military accepts that some technology will eventually fall into enemy hands. The challenge is to ensure that when it does, the damage is limited. In the case of the Zero, the damage to Japan's position was extensive, not because the Zero suddenly became useless. It didn't. Skilled Japanese pilots in Zeros continued to be dangerous opponents throughout the war, but the mystique was gone. The advantages were understood and could be countered. The psychological edge was lost. And perhaps most importantly, American aircraft designers had a clear template for what they needed to build to win the air war. The F-6F Hellcat, which entered service in early 1943, was in many ways an anti-Zero. It was heavier, more powerful, faster at high speeds, better in dives, equipped with armor and self-sealing tanks. It couldn't outturn a Zero at low speeds, but it didn't need to. It was designed to fight a different kind of battle, one where American advantages could be brought to bear. Hellcat pilots were trained specifically in the tactics that exploited the Zero's weaknesses. The combination of aircraft and tactics proved devastatingly effective. The Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of about 19-1 against all Japanese aircraft types. That's an extraordinary figure. It represents not just a good aircraft, but a complete system. Aircraft, tactics, training, logistics, all working together effectively. And at the foundation of that system was the intelligence gained from one captured Zero. Not the only factor, certainly, but an important one, a catalytic one, the knowledge that allowed all the other pieces to come together. As we near the end of this story, it's worth reflecting on what it means. On one level, it's a war story, a tale of combat and tactics and technology. But on another level, it's a story about how small moments can have large consequences, how individual human decisions and random chance can intersect with historical forces in ways that change outcomes. Tadayoshi Koga woke up on the morning of June the 4th, 1942, not knowing it would be his last day alive. He went through his pre-flight checks. He climbed into his Zero. He flew his mission. He engaged the enemy. He took damage. He made decisions about where to land based on what he could see and what he knew. And then he died, instantly, never knowing that his final flight would have consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. There's something profound about that. The idea that our actions ripple outward in ways we can't predict or control. Koga was trying to serve his country. He was trying to survive. He was doing his best in difficult circumstances. And the result of his efforts was to inadvertently help the enemy he was fighting against. There's no irony intended in that observation, just the acknowledgement that life and history are complex and outcomes are uncertain. For the Americans who captured the Zero, it must have felt like incredible good fortune. A gift from Providence. The break they desperately needed arriving at exactly the moment they needed it. They certainly treated it that way. They exploited every advantage they could extract from that captured aircraft. For the Japanese, had they known what happened, it would have been a devastating blow, not just materially, but psychologically. To have your most advanced technology fall into enemy hands intact, to know that all its secrets were being revealed, that would be a strategic nightmare. The fact that they didn't know probably helped them in some ways. Ignorance, in this case, prevented panic and maintained morale, even as the underlying situation was deteriorating. The history of technology is full of these moments where intelligence gathering changes the game. Enigma decryption in World War II, the capture of German rocket scientists after the war, industrial espionage in the Cold War, cyber warfare in the modern era. The methods change, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Understanding your opponent's capabilities and limitations is invaluable. One piece of good intelligence can be worth more than entire battalions in terms of strategic impact. But intelligence is only valuable if it's used effectively. The captured Zero could have been poorly tested, misanalyzed, ignored by commanders who preferred their existing doctrines. The Americans deserve credit not just for the good fortune of capturing the aircraft, but for their institutional response to that good fortune. They recognized what they had. They tested it thoroughly. They analysed the results carefully. They implemented changes effectively. That's not luck, that's competence. The final piece of the story is the long-term legacy. The captured Zero contributed to American victory in the Pacific. That victory ended World War II, at least in that theatre. The war's end reshaped the global order. Japan became a democracy under American occupation. The Cold War began. The world we live in today was shaped in part by the outcome of World War II. And World War II's outcome in the Pacific was influenced by many factors, one of which was the intelligence gained from Tadayoshi Koga's Zero on that foggy morning in June 1942. The connections are indirect and attenuated, certainly. You can't draw a straight line from Koga's crash to the modern world. But the connections exist nonetheless. History is a web of causation, not a chain. Every event influences every other event in ways that are sometimes profound and sometimes subtle, but always present. Koga never knew any of this. He died thinking, if he had time to think at all, that he'd failed in his mission, that he'd made a mistake that cost him his life. He couldn't have known that his final flight would be remembered 80 years later, that historians would study every detail of that day, that engineers would pore over his aircraft for months, that his name would be known to thousands of people who weren't born until decades after his death. There's something both humbling and awe-inspiring about that. None of us know how our actions will be remembered or what consequences they'll have. We make our decisions based on limited information and uncertain outcomes. We do our best. We try to serve whatever we believe in. And then the results unfold in ways we can't predict or control. The morning fog over Akutan Island has long since dissipated. The bog where Koga's Zero crashed has been undisturbed for decades, except for the occasional historian or aviation enthusiast making the difficult journey to visit the crash site. The war that Koga died in has passed from living memory into history. The veterans are nearly all gone now. The world has moved on, but the story remains. Not just as a tale of war and technology, but as a reminder of how history actually works. Not through grand gestures and inevitable forces alone, but through the accumulation of individual moments, decisions, accidents, coincidences. A young pilot making a split-second decision about where to land. An American patrol happening to fly over at just the right moment. Engineers and pilots making smart decisions about how to exploit an unexpected intelligence windfall. All of these small human choices aggregating into strategic consequences. Tadayoshi Koga was 19 years old when he died in the service of his country. His name deserves to be remembered, not as a villain or a victim, but as a human being, caught up in forces larger than himself, doing his duty as he understood it. The fact that his final flight served purposes he never intended doesn't diminish his service or his sacrifice. It just reminds us that history is complex, that outcomes are uncertain, and that every human life touches countless others in ways we can never fully understand. The sun eventually burned through the fog that morning. It always does. The Zero sat in the bog, silent and still, waiting to tell its secrets. And in that silence, in that stillness, the course of a war began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, inexorably, like a great ship slowly changing course. 1 degree of heading at a time, until eventually the destination is completely different. That's how wars are won. Not through single decisive moments alone, though those matter, but through the accumulation of small advantages, the steady application of lessons learned, the grinding attrition of will and resources. The captured zero was one small advantage, but it came at the right moment, and it was exploited well, and the ripples spread outward until they touched every corner of the Pacific War. And somewhere in all of that complexity, in all that history and technology and strategy, was a 19-year-old pilot who just wanted to land his damaged aircraft safely and get home. His story didn't end the way he hoped. But it did mean something. It mattered. And maybe that's all any of us can ask for in the end. That our lives matter. That what we do has meaning. That we're remembered not just as statistics or abstractions, but as human beings who lived and tried, and sometimes failed, and sometimes succeeded, and always affected the world around us, in ways both large and small. The fog over Akutan Island has lifted. The morning has passed into afternoon, into evening, into years and decades. But the memory remains. One pilot, one aircraft, one moment, and everything that followed from it